Hello, everyone. This is Philosophy of the People, Ben Bergson, Stefan Bertram. Starting an hour late today, so I could watch England-Serbia in the Euros, which we won. And so England fans are now furious because we didn't win in the manner that they would prefer.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm still just confused because you said something about watching football. It's like, the fuck you talking about, man? NFL preseason doesn't even start for months. So, it's clearly just a lie.
Yeah, it's European Gridian or whatever you call it. But today we're going to be talking about metaphysics, something that neither of us can even define. And with this thing that we can't define, we're going to talk about how we work out what the answers are.
Yeah, right. So roughly the distinction is that, you have value theory, which is the areas of philosophy that you're talking about, what's good or bad, right or wrong, beautiful or ugly. So aesthetics is part of value theory, et cetera, et cetera.
We'd be judging.
Where you're judging stuff. And epistemology, which, although one way of thinking about it and kind of the way I do it in this essay is that is itself kind of part of value theory, right? You're sort of trying to figure out epistemic values, standards, right? About, what adds up to justification or knowledge or any of that. And so that seems like either a sort of value theory question or sort of a conceptual analysis question. What do we mean, by these ideas? And then you have metaphysics, which, very roughly is like you're trying to figure out not how things should be or what we mean by something, but how things are. And the reason, as like a sort of way of cutting up areas of philosophical discussion, I guess maybe that's like clear enough, but the reason it's maybe hard to define is that the definition I just gave would also apply to physics, right? That you're trying.
The first line of the metaphysics article is on SEP, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It is not easy to say what metaphysics is.
Yeah, because literally, I think it's from Aristotle, since that was like after the physics.
Right, Aristotle meant like book 2 of the physics, basically.
Yeah. But like the sort of meaning it's come to have in the thousands of years since then is this stuff that are sort of questions about reality that in some sense go beyond what you're doing when you're doing physics. And yeah, that's pretty fuzzy. But there, we can at least point at examples of the sort of thing that we have in mind and say maybe some things about what they have in common. So, if you think about, philosophy of religion, spent a fair amount of time in this Substack, it's like, okay, is there a God or not? That seems like a metaphysical question. It's a question not about values or concepts, but about reality in that way. Do people have free will is maybe a metaphysical question, although there are ways of thinking about it that go into those other domains. Is certainly like stuff that I wrote about at one point last year about how to think about time is metaphysics, if anything is, right? Do the past and the future, do what we think of as the past and the future exist in the same way as what we think of as the present? Is it just sort of is now just an indexical like here that, identifies where you are in time, or does the present have some kind of exist in some way maybe, or exist, that the past doesn't anymore and the future doesn't yet.
The big concern with time on Reddit Ask Philosophy seems to be, can I think about it in a sufficiently fucked up way that I become immortal?
Yeah, probably not.
You would think is something that people would invent because they want to be immortal. But as with every theory of how there's some weird fucked up way you're immortal, this is then latched onto by depressed people who definitely don't want to be immortal. And then they're like, wow, it's fucked up that this weird fucked up theory makes me immortal. because I would like to die at some point.
And then the good news is that even if everybody technically exists for an infinite number of, instants or intervals or whatever, the good news is that you will still experience time as passing and then you'll die. So there you go. You're welcome.
Don't worry, Achilles will catch up to the turtle or whatever.
Yeah. This is pretty thoroughly tested. So yeah, those are, I think, the three examples I give in the essay, but you could also do like personal identity, if the teletransporter dissolves all the molecules I'm composed of on Earth while it, reconstructs me from local molecules on Mars. Is the person who steps out of the teletransporter station on Mars me, or is it a new person? That's like a metaphysical question. Yeah, you could multiply these, but I think that's probably enough to give a rough sense of what we have in mind. And so I think the thing that those have in common maybe is that at least in any direct way, like they're questions about reality, about how things are, but at least there doesn't seem to be any particularly direct way to answer them using the tools of the empirical sciences. That we can't like run an experiment and find out what the answer. There's no scenario where a guy in a white lab coat holds up a test tube and says, "Oh, all right, we solved it." There's there's the God particle right there, or whatever, right? Like that's not.
Yeah, I mean, like in quantum physics, there's quite a lot of involvement from philosophers in quite a direct way with kind of interpretations of quantum physics. But that's because at the moment we don't have any way to kind of to do a practical test, or even to have there's not particularly strong ideas of how even to do a theoretical test to distinguish them. And so within that context, the question is, interpretation of quantum mechanics is very much an interpretive question, like kind of which of these concepts and analysis of the data kind of make the most sense, even if there's no way for us to empirically distinguish between them.
Yeah, can cats and dogs can live together? If you follow the movements behind me for long enough.
I was going to say, if Ben leaves his camera on long enough, we can prove empirically, no metaphysics needed.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, look, I think quantum physics example is interesting because whether or not you think that there's like a subject matter domain that's specific to philosophy and like a different one that's specific to science, even if you don't think that, there's definitely like a set of techniques that philosophers use that are different from the kind of thing that empirical scientists typically spend most of their time doing.
Right, and philosophers normally have no fucking idea how to do quantitative methods, and we shouldn't try to get them to.
Yeah, to put it mildly, right? And there are things that we do at least have a sense of like what kinds of things that one set of methods seems to be more fruitful to use about, and which ones not, right? I mean, this is if you want if you're trying to figure out the rate of expansion of space-time by like doing thought experiments, then you're probably that's not gonna take you anywhere. Whereas and if you're there's no, like, the kinds of subjects we've been talking about, there's no obvious way to apply empirical methods. And like the quantum physics example is interesting because it's like, okay, you sort of do the like hard mathematically rigorous empirical work, and then it gives you some really confusing results, and there might actually there's actually an opening there for people who are good at like thinking really hard about how different kinds of ideas fit together or don't, right?
Conceptual engineers.
Yeah, exactly. Right. That like those people, there's actually, it's like, oh, it looks like, hey, this like weird thing that you're good at might actually be useful here. Come over and, help out. So yeah, I mean, like none of the questions that I just listed seem to be of the kind that there's, an obvious way. I mean, for some of them there might be, it's complicated, but like there's no direct way to just do science about any of these things, that there's like any, maybe you can make arguments that have some empirical premises, but to connect those to your preferred conclusions, you need a bunch of other premises that you can't really get from
With the personal identity thing, the exact physical going on is normally specified. Like it'll be like teletransport to different atoms, or teletransport to same atoms, or whatever. So there isn't really a way for physics to intervene here because kind of it's already specified in the problem, the exact physical combination of things.
Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. Right. So it's like there's sort of seems like kind of nothing more that can be said on that level. It seems really hard to see how an empirical discovery could be helpful for helping figure that out.
Right. Because it's not even a thing of like, everyone believes that the guy at the end would think he was the same person. But
right. Exactly.
So also like psychological testing or whatever wouldn't be.
Yeah. It wouldn't be relevant if we actually built a teletransporter and saw whether people thought they were the same person, because we all assumed that they would, right? Because you'd have all the memories and all that stuff, right? That's kind of not interesting. The interesting question is
well, if they didn't, that'd be fucking weird.
Yeah, I guess that would be surprising, and that might actually make people rethink it a little bit. But yeah, the assumption is that they would, right? So it wouldn't be interesting that they did. Kushlook says Democritus thought out the atom without an empirical test. Yeah, but I mean, like this is like he kind of got lucky there, right? Like,
yeah, it's the thing of like, was there any good reason he thought that, or was it just kind of he thought that and other people thought other things, and then he was the one, and he kind of was he. Like he's probably right now, but he wasn't right when we thought the atom was the atom. Turns out the atom isn't the atom.
Yeah, right. Because like what we call atoms aren't actually atoms in Democritus's sense, because they do actually have finer parts within them. They're subatomic parts, and so yeah, it's an interesting question about whether Democritus even is right, with protons, electrons, whatever. But like, regardless, it's like, yeah, look, this is like somebody who's really good at sort of thinking through the conceptual possibilities could be like, yeah, hey, here's a way that reality could be. It could be that there are these like incredibly basic small things that everything else is composed of. And that might even be a useful contribution, because that might, help make that occur to later scientists to, make sense of what they're of their observations. But like in itself, Democritus doesn't really seem like he could have been justified in believing that, right? It's like, how could he know that?
Right. It's the difference between justified true belief and just true belief.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, you could have Kushlik says, I recall the question has to do with substances could make other substances, and so there must be some sort of basic substance. But it's like that doesn't follow, right? I mean, it could be that it's all
yeah, you just have things which are fundamentally qualitatively different.
Yeah, or you could have, well, yeah, one, we don't have to be made of the same basic stuff. Like there's no a priori guarantee of that. Two, it doesn't even necessarily have to be the case that there is like a smallest unit, right? It could just be infinitely divisible. It's not, right? But probably. Like, yeah, it's probably not. But I mean, that's an empirical discovery.
I mean, this is reminding me of last week, because Aristotle couldn't see that everything was made of the same basic labor substance.
Right. There you go. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, this is like, yeah. So, I mean, it's, yeah. So whatever. I mean, philosophy is good for many things, but it's not, it's not going to give you everything. Is maybe not that interesting. But I think the more interesting question is, well, okay, what's in the domain of things it is good for, right? The sort of metaphysical questions, the kind that we listed off earlier. There's, I think there are some real reasons to worry about whether, as you put it in your description for this, I think the way you said it is whether we're just bashing our tiny little heads against the wall when we try to figure this stuff out, right? That like, even if you think, and like there are like other reasons to be sort of skeptical about this, or even to think that, I don't know, skepticism is exactly the right word, even to just think that these are like nonsense questions or something that I'm not even really indulging in this essay. I'm sort of assuming at the minimum that these are like coherent questions to ask.
Apart from the chair one, you don't like that.
Yeah, except for the chair one. I don't like that. Yeah. That's the do chairs exist, or they're only quantum particles arranged chairwise? I think that seems like a pretty plausible case to me, that where this really might be a distinction without a difference.
I mean, yeah, but I mean, I guess there's more to Mereology than some people being like, there's chairs, and then some other people being like, there's not chairs. Because there's various things in the middle where it's like, well, is this a reasonable thing to
Yeah.
consider? Like, are there any real objects which we think are really things which aren't like physically connected to each other?
Yeah, for sure. Right. So the extreme position on the one end is that, whatever the most basic particles are the only things that exist. And there aren't even things that are like composed of them. That's like, I guess, mereological nihilism. And then on the other end, you have the position that anytime two things exist, A and B, then their mereological sum, A plus B, exists also, right? So this gets really fun if you combine it with the view about the ontology of time that says that it all exists equally. So you can say like, Julius Caesar's big toe on his left foot plus the pinky toe on my right foot plus the first car that I drove in 1996. That there's an object that those compose, which sort of seems also not, that, I don't know. Actually, to me, I will say, I'm not terribly attracted to that view, but I will say that it's like less obvious to me that that's wrong than the first one is wrong. Like I think that,
I listened to a really good podcast on the New Books in X. I think it was New Books in Philosophy, about a mereological view, talking about kind of, when should we think about composite objects as real, like the example you gave there. But I can never find it again. It was really annoying.
Yeah. This is, yeah, I see. Okay. Well, we haven't compared their singing voices yet, so we'll have to do that later. But yeah, give me a raised right hand, But in any case, like I think that the most plausible views are probably somewhere in between, and there's probably actually are interesting debates to be had about the
I guess probably the perspective you're outlining is this is one of the ones where probably our intuitions are probably the most right.
Yeah. I mean, I guess maybe maybe the way I framed this in the essay is wrong. Maybe the way I should actually, which was like, hey, sometimes people really are just talking past each other when they're arguing about metaphysics. But maybe if we really do a little more excavation here, maybe my intuition is really just like, oh, for fuck's sake, of course there are chairs. So in any case,
Ben, how many holes does a toilet tube have? These are important questions. Don't care. What about on communism, Ben? Will you care then?
Well, all I know is they'll be made of gold, right? Yeah, I think, I saw a discussion in the chat about Judith Butler's gender trouble, which might actually not be entirely off point here. I remember reading something like 15 years ago where somebody was complaining about how analytic philosophers spend all this time talking about whether they're chairs, but they never like really seem to be very interested in are their genders, which
right, much more interesting kind of disputed object.
Yeah, exactly. Now I will say I think the pendulum swung over, and I think lots more people are take a active interest in that, and and I think they're probably more analytic philosophers who do the annoying thing that like continental theory people always do about like just sort of doing extremely esoteric theory and telling themselves that they're doing revolution. But in any case, I think the
It does remind me of that thing where the Matt Walsh thing where he's like define a woman, and like the philosopher struggles with that, the analytic struggles with that. But also, if you asked him to define a chair, he would have struggled. So it's not really anything to do with liberal
yeah,
gender ideology.
yeah. Well, which is always, I mean, the funny thing is, I actually think there are people who, I'm not, one of them. It's just not a, for better or worse, it's just not a question that I've spent a tremendous amount of time thinking about, right? But like, but I actually think there are people who have like extremely well worked out answers to that question, and he really talk about them. Like, I mean, I actually kind of wish it's like, I don't know, did like the Matt? I haven't watched the Matt Walsh documentary because I don't hate myself enough.
Right. I
But
mean, it's
like,
not meant to be. It's all just bait and being like,
yeah,
like
I don't think.
Just
I don't think he,
on academic stores, be like, woman.
yeah, I don't think he visited like the Princeton philosophy department and asked them, right? That's I think he might have gotten some better answers. But I also think like my sort of bottom line thing has always been what you just said. It's like this sort of, oh, see, you can't give me a set of non-circular necessary and sufficient conditions. I always found really unimpressive as grounds for like deep skepticism about gender, because it's like, well,
No,
hold up.
people are always asking about as philosophy for non-circular definitions. It's like definitions are meant to be circular. They're not pointing back at themselves. They're not really definitions.
I mean, there's a certain sense in which you want non-circular, but like whatever. It's like the point is like it's a nice thing to have, but like the kind of definition that people are making a big point of how hard it is to give about gender. It's like, yeah, it's also incredibly hard to give it about share, right? It's like
I really like the defined chair thing. Not when I was at this place, but I was in my previous place I rented, because the chair I had there didn't have any legs. It was all just one bit of curving metal and with a kind of seat on top.
Yeah, right, exactly. It seems like that should count as a chair. So much for most
I mean, it
definition.
definitely fucking sat on it. Like,
There's
it
the
did all
classic.
it did all the chair things that this chair does with its fucking.
There's the classic Twitter thing where what's his name? The guy who made like Father Ted, and he's like, he did some funny TV shows, but then he like became his brain was poisoned by the internet, and he just became a really annoying culture warrior. I don't remember this guy's name, but anyway, he was like fighting with somebody about this, and they made the same point to him. It's like, okay, give me necessary and sufficient conditions for a chair. I don't remember what he came up with, but like then everybody immediately pointed out that like by his definition, a horse would be a chair.
Right.
It's it's difficult. I mean, this is why they killed Socrates, that he was annoying people trying to get them to give him necessary and sufficient conditions definitions, and then poking logical holes in the shitty definitions they came up with. And
you didn't think of asking me about chairs and shit.
and then, it was just like justice and all that.
They should have asked about beds, because then we would have had an easy time last week.
Right. And then right, would have helped out his student Aristotle. But yeah, and then there's also like and then like there's like Wittgenstein, who famously gives up on trying to come up with the definition of game. And there is actually somebody who the fuck is the book, The Grasshopper and something. There is a book that this is unimpressive. I'm forgetting basically every detail about it, but it's actually an interesting book that came out in like the late 20th century sometime, by somebody who was like, actually, no, here are necessary sufficient conditions for a game. And they came up with something like somewhat plausible in the first part of it. And then I don't know if it's totally held up to scrutiny, but like they came up with like an interesting sort of like, oh, that might actually be right definition of game. And then the more interesting part of it is in the second part, which is like the normative part. It's like not really that connected, where they have this argument that in like in a society, in a post-scarcity society, playing games would be like the main thing that people would do, with their time to sort of, make their activities meaningful. So anyway, I should actually go back to that book and write something about it at some point. But putting all that aside, whether or not there are genders, and I see I've invited some furious discussion into the chat because this is like saying Candyman 3 times. If you bring up the are there genders issue or anything like that, but putting that aside, right? Like, okay, so some of this Mereology stuff, there's an interesting question about whether, it's like at least somewhat plausible to me that people might sometimes be talking past each other. So that's like one strategy for like dealing with this sort of, the basic thing that the essay is revolving around is that if you have certain kinds of, science-y sensibilities that you probably should have, for more general reasons, there's something a little bit embarrassing about armchair metaphysics, and it can be a little bit hard to justify what we're doing, right? When we do, a priori arguments about these metaphysical issues, if you look at like kind of thinking of them at the wrong angle, it's like, oh, it's, what's this? How could we possibly be justified in doing this? And so one strategy for diffusing that is to say, well, maybe we can deflate some of these debates, that we can show that like really people aren't actually doing the thing it's hard to see how we could be justified in doing and arguing about like the nature of reality itself. Maybe they're just like, maybe this is all just battling conceptual schemes or whatever. They're having verbal disputes, right? They're ultimately having disputes about how to use language. And, I think, that might be true to some extent in some cases. Like, I think the Mereology example about chairs, I don't think it would be crazy to think that that's what's going on there. But there are other cases where it really doesn't seem that way, right? It seems like we really are pretty robustly having an argument about what's true in external reality. And yeah, like I said, there are ways that you could be a more radical skeptic about all this and just say this is like nonsense or there's pseudo questions or whatever. And I'm just kind of starting from the position here that no, these are all at least sort of coherently posable questions. Like whether or not we could know what the right answer is, there are at least real questions here. And still saying, even if you assume all that, right? Like just, take it for granted that, I don't know, that truth is about correspondence to reality, that, some discourses could be better than others, that, we're not so trapped within conceptual schemes. We can't ask the questions, all that stuff, right? Like assume that like we really can coherently ask these questions. That still leaves this huge issue about whether we can just be justified in answers to those questions, right? I mean, so the title of the essay is The District 9 Objection to Metaphysics, and it just comes from something I always think about. In the science fiction movie District 9, there's a scene where what's essentially a small alien child just sort of intuits how to operate an intergalactic spaceship. We talked about this a bit at the end of last time. And yeah, I can still remember, I was living on South Beach. So went to the theater on Lincoln Avenue in Miami Beach with my friend Michelle, and we were leaving the theater and kind of laughing about that scene because it seemed sort of, absurd in pretty obvious ways. And she kind of made this jokey metaphor about like, oh, isn't that kind of what, we do, right? This is like a lot of philosophy. Thank you, Hector. A lot of philosophy kind of seems like this, that, that you're sort of trying to figure things out just kind of by muddling through with intuition on questions that it just doesn't seem like we have any real way of of answering, right? Like that just seem like they're just sort of beyond our cosmic pay grade. And I think, and so like what the essay comes from is that's like, look, I'm not convinced enough by this critique that I, I'm going to stop finding the questions interesting or even sometimes perhaps endorsing arguments about them. But like, it does give me a little bit of pause about what I'm doing when I do that. Like, I think there is like a pretty real problem here, right? That like we know, like the sciences seem to be a really effective way of figuring out what's true about the world. And then, when I start, but it's like, look, I can, you can have all the philosophical training in the world to make really, really rigorous arguments, but, no argument is, the argument's only as good as the premises are. Right. And so there's a question about like, okay, well, to the extent that you're just sort of bottoming out in your like intuitive sense of how things seem to be, then there's a real question about, well, how seriously do you take that? Right. I mean, because if we're talking about like, there are other kinds of intuitions that seem to be, a bit more respectable. If you have like normative intuitions, that seems like, okay, well, one way to think about what's going on with normative arguments might be, if you're sort of very influenced by like David Hume and, there's, might just be, that's like, well, look, I care about certain goals and I'm trying to convince you that given the stuff that you care about, even if you're not fully aware that you care about it, but the process of arguing about it can sort of bring out your underlying commitments. Maybe you should care about that stuff too. And if you think anything in that realm, right, is remotely right, like is even close to the right way to think about what's going on when we argue about normative frameworks, then like, yeah, normative intuitions might be kind of okay. Conceptual intuitions seem like they're kind of okay. Like when we say, oh, well, you say knowledge is justified true belief, but then intuitively you wouldn't regard blah, blah, blah as an instance of knowledge, even though it's a justified true belief. It's like, well, look, ultimately what we're trying to figure out, is what we as humans mean, right? By these, like that these are our concepts, right? Like it doesn't seem crazy that we would have some kind of underlying access to like what we mean. But then like, metaphysical intuitions seem like the runt of the litter as far as like the respectability of intuitions that we can appeal to go. Cause like, look, I'm not, it's like, I mean, in certain contexts, like I'm very drawn towards just being pretty dismissive about these, right? Like I don't know. So like we might have talked about this at one point in the past. I don't remember, but like William Lane Craig's, yeah, I think we did like his version of like the cosmological argument for the existence of God, which comes from medieval Islamic thinkers originally, but it's like his modernization of it. He, one of the big premises is that there can't be like actually infinite quantities of anything. Therefore, there couldn't be an actually infinite amount of time in the past. And the argument for you can't have an actually infinite amount of time is like you start thinking about the properties of actually infinite collections and they seem really weird. And I'm very inclined when I think about that to think like, yeah, but like, why is that informative? Right. I mean, like something sounds strange to us. Like, yeah, sure. But like, I don't know. I mean, our brains evolved to kind of be good at enough at interacting with certain kinds of finite quantities of things for, survival purposes. I don't really expect us to have a good handle on the properties of infinite things like that. Those seem like really weird and sort of jangle up against our intuitive sense of things in a weird way. Seems kind of fine to me. I mean, certainly even with like mathematics, a lot of, like it's one of the pleasures of learning about mathematics is figuring out like cases of things that seem like intuitively like they could not possibly be true, that you can like prove have to be true. And so it's like, I don't know, when we start thinking about stuff like about metaphysics of time, for example, personal identity, whatever, it's like, are we just appealing to are the intuitions we're appealing to, they're sort of any more respectable than the kind of intuition that's violated by like simple examples about probability and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about kind of our hierarchy of the degree to which we kind of respect intuitions. Because
Yeah.
with, for instance, folk physics or intuitive physics, there's, you know, folk physics is generally like a highly successful enterprise, as is kind of folk psychology.
Yeah.
And that gives us, I think, if we have already the belief or some reason to think that morality is objective, then I
Yeah.
think that gives us good reason in the same sense to think that we have at least strong kind of access to facts about morality through just kind of intuition. And obviously that won't be perfectly worked out, but in the same way that folk physics is often wrong, but incredibly correct in many ways, the same with folk psychology and so on. But I guess the question with kind of folk metaphysics and then kind of the development of those intuitions into something substantive is kind of like, what do they apprehend to?
Yeah. Right. I mean, so and is there like a story we can tell about why it would be at least somewhat reliable that makes as much sense as folk physics or folk psychology, right? That like, because if it is like those things, that's actually not that bad, right?
No,
That like if
it'd be great.
yeah, it's like, okay, those things are obviously very fallible, right? Like, and they're many cases which they fail, but like they're mostly accurate. And if all we're doing is like, look, we're just trying to figure out what seems like it's probably true as best we can tell, and we're humble about enough about it to be like, yeah, if we do actually get some science that's directly relevant, we'll obviously like let that outvote the folk metaphysics. Then like, yeah, that seems totally fine. But then the question is, do we have such a story? And that's probably less clear. I and I think that so there are a couple of strategies I talk about for like sort of assuaging these concerns to some extent in the essay. One of them is sort of one of them is that some metaphysical questions seem like they might actually reduce to the kinds of questions that seem less problematic than like real proper metaphysics does. So like I think some of the free will stuff we've talked about many times here can I think it's like, look, to the extent that it seems like to a great extent that discussion, or at least a big part of it, right? Like not all of it for sure, right? Like so but a big part of it reduces to a combination of questions where it seems like appeal to intuition is a lot more respectable. So the part that doesn't is like, I don't know, like a lot of arguments for libertarianism about free will, right? Where, remember, libertarianism in this case is just the same word, unrelated meaning. But the view that we have free will in the way that we wouldn't if everything was, causally determined. A lot of the arguments for that do seem to rely on this kind of inference from like a priori intuitions to the claim that like cause and effect determinism isn't true in ways that seem kind of crazy, right? It doesn't seem like we should be able to figure it out that way. But like, look, if you think about like the argument between like compatibilists and free will skeptics, that seems like really, since it's not an argument about whether determinism is true, it seems like it's really an argument about two things. One is the what do we mean question, right? Kind of trying to examine our concept of, free will or control or whatnot. And then the other one, to the extent that the answer to the first question is, oh, maybe there are like a few different concepts here we can disentangle from each other. Then the other question is, well, which of these is the kind of control that matters for moral responsibility, at which point we're in normativity land. So that might be okay too. But then, so that's like one excuse for doing metaphysics. That's like, no, some of these, at least some arguments about metaphysical questions might reduce to other arguments where it's like a little easier to see how we can respectably carry out the argument. And then another sort of consideration and defense of metaphysics that I give is that it's it's like the good company defense, that if you think about there are at least some cases where the defense I ran for free will clearly isn't going to work. We're clearly like actually arguing about how objective reality is, not concepts, not norms, but like how the world is. But we might do it in part by making moves that seem respectable because they're because they themselves are part of like much more respectable, forms of investigation of the world. So, if you have, so like the example I give is a lot of, arguments for atheism are going to have to do with some kind of appeal to simplicity, that given the, like, even if our evidence isn't, inconsistent with some sort of God existing, it's at least it seems like, the simpler explanation is that there isn't any sort of God.
I mean, it's interesting with arguments from God because a lot of them kind of are amenable to physics stuff, while some are like kind of the most kind of oldest metaphysical questions. But then even stuff like the cosmological argument, which used to kind of be, I guess, pure metaphysics, is now kind of influenced by physical theories about the Big Bang and stuff.
Yeah, true. This is yeah, no, absolutely. Also, Mandy, Cerberus, I think it's 3 penises but 1 set of balls. So I don't know.
I'd never even considered a possibility that Cerberus could have more than 1 cock. Like, they're literally just 3 heads and well, not one of everything else, but 1 X of everything else. Like,
yeah. Fair enough. Yeah, I think. So yeah, so you have, but like certainly, okay, like the biggest argument, for the non-existence of God, historically and for good reasons, is the argument from evil. I always think of my friend Mark from grad school. Had a line about this where he's like, look, if somebody goes around, tells you that there's a giant, there's like an invisible giant who goes around all day, every day, painting the sky yellow, your first question won't be, where's the evidence? Your first question will be, why isn't the sky yellow? Right. Like, so if you say there's this morally perfect being who created and rules the universe, then your first question is going to be, well, hold up. Why are there all of these, morally appalling things that happen all the time in
right,
the
like, it's a method of responding to any argument for God, because then you can be like, okay, well, if that is true, why does the world not seem coherent with that fact?
Yeah, exactly, right. But then that's probably not going to be the only reason anybody's going to be an atheist, because that's not going to be like, if you just like, yeah, that gets you to a denial of the sort of God that's postulated by most religions, of course, most theistic religions. But it doesn't get you all the way to like no divine entity at all, right? Like, I mean, surely just about like nobody calls themselves an atheist and only means that they don't believe in the all PKG, right? All powerful, all knowing, all good God, right? Everybody who calls himself an atheist presumably it's not like you think the world was created by Cthulhu, right? And you know, and so you're like, oh, therefore I'm an atheist about the all PKG, right? Like you think or like a really morally mediocre god, you know, who's because I guess with Cthulhu you'd then have the problem of good. But yeah,
things don't seem nearly as miserable enough for the world to be made by Cthulhu.
Yeah, why does Cthulhu allow sunshine and puppies? Yeah.
Why does he allow delightful podcasts?
Yeah, exactly. It would be so easy for him to prevent this. Yeah. But yeah, you could have a morally middling sort of God, and neither the problem of good nor the problem of evil would arise. But you know, if you're an atheist, presumably you also you also reject that, and it's hard to say how you'd reject it except with some kind of, well, the simpler explanation is that there isn't one move, and then so that this seems like, okay, we're really doing, you know, proper metaphysics, but it might also seem okay because this saying, okay, if you have two explanations that are both consistent with all the observable facts, so you pick the one that's like simpler and more explanatory and more elegant and all that, that's got to be okay, right? Because if you're like, you can't, like, if your whole reason for being suspicious of metaphysics is that, you know, you're like a tough-minded, sciencey kind of person, it's like, well, look, if you can't make that move, you also can't do science, because like science is all that, right? Like that's like it's always the case that, you know, I mean, this is the stuff that people like Quine wrote about, right? That the theory is always underdetermined by the evidence. Like it's never the case that there's exactly one theory that's logically consistent with the evidence. There are always multiple possible theories. They're logically consistent with the evidence. You just either consider and throw out, or don't even consider in the first place, explanations that that are that, you know, that are just like too convoluted, or, you know, too you know, don't explain enough, or blah blah blah, right? That like fail on these theoretical virtues. So that's one kind of defense, is the good company defense. Although, and also note though that only, you know, that only gives you a very limited pass to do metaphysics, right? Like it's mostly of a very negative kind, right? That you can't, you know, that's like, you can throw out certain kinds of, you know, you can like deny certain kinds of metaphysical claims using that. It's a lot harder to see how it sort of gets you to positive claims. But then it's like, okay, but aren't there, yeah, then, you know, you think about like the philosophy of time example, certainly, and there certainly some of the arguments that are actually very compelling to me really do seem to rely on those folk metaphysics intuitions. So we might be getting into trouble. And, you know, like if you say, you know, like an argument against presentism, the view that only the present moment exists, that has always seemed pretty compelling to me, is that it seems just totally ludicrous to say that nobody ever perceives anything that exists. But of course, perception takes time, right? You know, by the time you perceive something, it's, you know, a fraction of a second in the past, you know, so that seems like a really, so it's like, oh, everything I ever perceive has the same ontological status as like a unicorn. That seems wrong. But yeah, then I'm just like very blatantly appealing to metaphysical intuitions. You might think a more respectable way to argue, you know, for the same, you know, for like the B theory of time, the view that it all exists in exactly the same way, is the argument from Einsteinian physics that it's a lot easier to see how the B theory fits together with relativistic physics than the A theory, because if whether or not two events are simultaneous depends on reference frames, then that gets really confusing when you start thinking about the idea that there's this metaphysically privileged now, because whether something depends on that, like if event 1 and event 2 are happening, if event 1 is happening now and event 2 is happening simultaneously with event 1, then event 2 is part of now. But wait a second, if simultaneity is relative to reference frame, is being part of the metaphysically privileged now relative to reference frames, what would that even mean? It's so confusing. And this might be a different way of justifying metaphysics. It's like, oh, look, here we're making a metaphysical argument, but it's cool because science is doing the heavy lifting, right? We're just kind of like doing some conceptual legwork to connect up, issue 1 with issue 2, but like ultimately the real core premise here is being supplied by the empirical sciences. So if our sort of core reason for being embarrassed about metaphysics is that we're trying to figure stuff out that it doesn't seem like we should be able to figure out this way, that like, that's like a job for science, then good, we're justified now. But and this is a whole, there's a whole tradition of like justifying metaphysics this way. Like, I mentioned Quine earlier, and it's like sort of Quinean inspired metaphysicians tend to think of it like, well, basically what we should be doing is like, we're sort of doing some conceptual and logical work, but like really we should be reading our ontology off of our best scientific theories that, we do, whatever our best confirmed science is, we kind of infer from it, right? Which entities we should believe in, and, and all of that stuff. And that might be, that's perfectly respectable, but, just to really not let people off the hook too easily, the big thing I want to point out here is that the underlying assumption, if you're going to do that, is that you think that our, best confirmed scientific theories are true, which is itself kind of a metaphysical claim. And really beyond that, you have to be making some kind of like bare minimum claim that like, I don't know, there is such a thing as external reality that, right. We can, that our claims can correspond to or not, right? To even make sense of doing science in the first place. And it seems like it might end up being circular in the bad way if we, wow. All right. All right. No reading puns on here. Yeah, it might just like, it might just seem circular in a bad or indefensible way to do that, which suggests to me that, we might actually have to appeal to some metaphysical intuitions at some point in this process, and which, might be a little embarrassing, but it might just be, look, we're stuck, we're prisoners of our sense of how reality is, and like we could break out to the extent that like, some scientific result or something gives us a reason to, but other than that, that's just kind of the deal. And if you're going to be in the business of trying to figure out how reality is, I don't think you can entirely escape appeal to this stuff. And so, of course, you don't have to be. You can take yourself out of the business of trying to figure out how reality is, but that's kind of easier said than done. Like it's really hard. I mean, try it, right? Like everybody's homework is to like try to not make any assumptions about, about implicitly or explicitly about, how external reality is. And I guess I'm pretty skeptical that we can do that. And so I sort of think that it's like, look, if you've got to do it, like, this is the, at the risk of getting poetic in kind of a dumb way, right? I mean, if this is like the little window pane we've got to look out of, it might be smeared and whatever, but it's like, it's what we've got, right? We're like, you could choose not to look, but like, this is what we're stuck with, right? So like, we might as well.
The line in the essay was cute.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we might be small, ridiculous alien children, but we're never getting off the spaceship. So we might as well try to figure out the controls.
Nice. I've been restraining all my yawns, but I was thinking I should just let a big one out just to see how many people are in the audience I could get to sympathetically yawn. Even if it's mostly like 5 p.m. their time.
Sure. Yeah. I guess it's getting to be 6 on the East Coast, but yeah.
Ben, how have we discussed metaphysics for now, but we haven't discussed being as such?
Oh yeah, there you go.
That used to be all of metaphysics, but I don't really know what that means.
Oh, well, that's okay because nobody else did either.
Like when I think of being, I think of like Heideggerian
I,
being,
yeah.
which I
Well,
mean, I guess is also metaphysics, but it's metaphysics done phenomenologically, which is like is kind of almost the opposite.
yeah. I mean, so there's a book called Heidegger's Confusions by Paul Edwards, where he in the first part of the book, in the second part, he's like arguing that all of Heidegger's views about death and stuff are stupid and pseudo profound, but um, in the first part of it, he's talking about Heidegger's stuff about being as such and being with a capital B and all of this stuff. And I've got to say, I really enjoyed like I really enjoyed reading it. His thesis is that Heidegger, I mean, just to simplify a little bit, like Heidegger should have read Kant and Bertrand Russell on existence, and he would have been much less confused. And it's and there was when I first read this, I made the mistake of posting about it, and
The stands got you.
the stands got me, and I reached a point in my sparring with the stands where I realized that, like, okay, because they do have a point that, like, I don't know if Heidegger ever claimed to have read Bertrand Russell, but like he certainly, I mean, I'm sure he did read. With like how much he actually internalized the point is a different question, right? But like there are certainly places where Heidegger refers to Kant stuff about existence not being a property. Whether he exactly gets the point as it would relate to his stuff, I think is a little bit of a separate question. I don't think that follows just from him having like written a chapter of his book where he talks about Kant on the ontological argument. But I reached a point in my arguments with the Heidegger stands where I realized that if I'm going to defend Edwards or even just figure out in my own head whether Edwards is entirely right about this, I'm going to have to read a fuckload more Heidegger. And we're kind of at an impasse because I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So I might just have to settle for not having justified beliefs about Heidegger.
Yeah, I mean, reading Heidegger was fun on the masters because we did like late Heidegger stuff where he was much more kind of grounded, like his stuff on technology, talking about how the Nile after it being dammed up and then was like filled with tourist boats or whatever. The experience of these people on the tourist boats compared to kind of the German who was confronted with this kind of like deadly river, this medieval German who's confronted with this deadly river. Those are just two different rivers. There's a very significant sense where those are just two completely different rivers. But then, yeah, a lot of it is like him just saying weird kind of Greek words, which he defines in his own way, and you're like, damn, that's fucking sick. But it's probably like, as you say, pseudo profound.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm open to the idea. Let's put it this way: there are people who I have a lot of respect for, who have like found things in Heidegger that they found like insightful and useful and incorporated into other things. And I'm certainly in no position to say that they're wrong. But I also do suspect there being Heidegger of having at least some pseudo profundity in the mix. It's actually kind of funny. And Shea says Heidegger in the chat, GTA chat says Heidegger, horrible human, but no dummy. And to be clear, my point here has nothing to do with Heidegger being a horrible human, right? I mean, it's like you could, like if he was a Nazi who said a bunch of things about like metaphysics that I find totally plausible, I would be like, wow, it's very unfortunate that he's a Nazi, but nevertheless, right? Like,
I mean, it is really funny that he's like, there's this thing Dasein, which is this particular thing that humans have, where we have this particularly mediated kind of encounter with the world that we're all thrown into from birth, but not the Jews though.
Yeah, I mean, he was.
It goes from just such like kind of this abstract philosophical level to then just being like the most base kind of racist, which it just shows kind of the power of these ideas over great men are just unbounded.
Yeah, it's it's like almost the equivalent of like he's just in the middle of writing a philosophy paper and he gets like distracted by muttering about how much he hates Jews.
Yeah, like it's not much better than that.
That's and he was like,
it's a bit like the what's it from the Roman Senate, and in addition to my speech, Carthage must be destroyed.
Oh yeah, Cato the Elder, yeah. Sure. Yeah, I mean, I will say, I mean, it has nothing to do with the Edwards critique. I mean, Edwards actually tastefully leaves the Nazi stuff to one side, but like it is kind of funny that there used to be a time when the Heidegger stands would be like, oh no, sure, he may have been a member of the Nazi party.
But then some empirical evidence dropped.
Yeah, then some empirical evidence dropped. It's like, oh no. He was like man was not going through the motions. He was into it. Which he was a very excited and excitable Nazi. And even the stuff, and it's like, I think the empirical evidence from the Black Notebooks, I think, like really made it just kind of impossible for even the, people I know who are most sympathetic to Heidegger to be like, we're kind of like, okay, this is actually really bad. But like, even before then, if you wanted to see it, like, I don't know, if you read like his correspondence with Marcuse in the late 40s, like after the war, he's like, this seems not great, because it's like, even when the Nazis had been defeated and he had every interest in the world in distancing himself from it, he was still being pretty, he was like, yeah, the Nazis did some bad things, but, Soviet Union was really bad. It had to be saved from that. And, I don't know.
It didn't really save anyone from the Soviet Union.
Also very true. Quite the opposite.
I mean, right? I guess it saved particular people from the Soviet Union by killing them.
Yeah. But yes, territorially, it did very much the opposite of that.
In the, I can't remember what it's called. I don't think it's called Critique of Technology, but the Technology book, which came out in 1958, he does use the Holocaust as like an out switch, as kind of like a really obviously terrible example of the use of technology by modernist states. But that's a really weak thing to get to by 1958. It's like at that point, everyone can say that, mate. You're not being particularly profound.
By 1958, you've gotten to the point, it's like, okay, the death camps were very bad.
Yeah.
Right? And like, even there, it's like, I don't know. It's like, death camps were really bad really shows how bad modern technology is. Does it? Or does it show that like your political project was really bad? Right? Like that seems like more the immediate point here. But
I like that we're talking about the Holocaust and people in chat are talking about like root beer.
Yeah. Also, I mean, I'm not saying I'm not saying there's nothing like interesting or thought provoking in Heidegger.
But and I think it's also it's perfectly, there's lots of ways to point out that he was dumb without being like, oh, he was also a Nazi.
Yeah, I mean, look, I saw somebody in the chat bring up the Heidegger-Wittgenstein comparison, and I'd say that Wittgenstein, I mean, it's like, look, I will say, like, my immediate reaction to Heidegger is that, we could sort of consider him from the vantage point of pure philosophy, or we can consider him from the vantage point of politics, and consider from the vantage point of pure philosophy. He taught generations of people to write in an incredibly obscure and unhelpful way. and consider from the vantage point of politics, he was a Nazi, which, I think is one of the worst things to be. Hot take in 2024. So, I guess I'm generally unsympathetic to him, but I mean, I'm not saying like nobody should read Being in Time or like learn anything from it or find anything interesting there, right? Like I'm sure, I did an episode of the main show with Matt McManus who talked about Heidegger. I think he had plausible things to say about, things that were interesting in Heidegger. I do think that I do suspect with Edwards that if you sort of really make an effort to translate everything into much more clear language, then like some things that seem really profound probably aren't. But that is just an uncharitable assumption because I've got to say, I mean, I'm in the middle of teaching this capital class. I'm trying to finish a book. I'm just not going to read a tremendous amount of Heidegger anytime soon.
You know the story about Wittgenstein trying to go to the Soviet Union, right?
I actually don't know this, no.
Oh, you don't know? I mean, it's a fantastic anecdote. So Wittgenstein had become very enamored of the Soviet Union, and
Yeah.
he traveled there in the 1930s, and didn't become unenamored with the Soviet Union. That wasn't the problem. The problem was he traveled there with his boyfriend, and he asked the Soviets, "Okay, I'm ready to emigrate and live here. I want to be a farmer." And they were like, "You can't be a farmer. You have to be a philosopher." And he was like, "Well, I don't want to be a philosopher. I want to be a farmer. And if I have to be a philosopher, I'm not coming. I'm just going to stay in Oxford." And they were like, "Well, fuck. Okay, whatever, man."
That's awesome. It's like the exact opposite of the meme with the person being forced, the like Twitter communist being forced at gunpoint to dig ditches. It's like no, I just want to dig ditches. Sorry, man, you have to be a philosophy professor.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of probably more frequent than you think. Kind of the radical intellectuals of your time were kind of interested in getting their hands dirty quite often, while kind of the bureaucrats are like, "No, you should do the thing that you're good at."
Yeah.
Even if it's not coal mining.
Yeah. It's like I think it came out after the fall of the Soviet Union when the KGB archives were opened that Ernest Hemingway tried to become a Soviet spy, and they were like, "This doesn't seem like it's within your skill set. No."
Yeah, I mean, it's basically one of these stories for every great man of the 20th century in one way or another.
Fair enough. Well, I'll do. I don't know. I have a. I'll do a little bit of farm labor, and I'll teach a philosophy class at the commune. So
I was looking at jobs at Newcastle University, and one of them was for a farm worker. Didn't work for the philosophy department though.
Sure.
Ben, I've looked at the article for next week. It seems fun. Is that what we're going to do?
Sure. Yeah, let's do it.
Do you describe it to the class?
It's Euthyphro on Twitter, or the joys and frustrations of talking about philosophy on the internet. And it is, it's basically about some expressions of divine command ethics popping up from sources I wouldn't necessarily expect online, and the way that a lot of sort of way like and sort of breaking down some of what's wrong with it, and also kind of using that to think a little bit about the ways that social media discussion of philosophy tends to depress me, because I think I think that the sort of thing that gets people rewarded in that context for being extremely based is sort of points in the opposite direction from like actually trying to come up with things that you could say that are plausibly true?
You remember the galaxy is wet thing?
Vaguely.
I was trying to convince some guy that the properties of particular things within some composite thing aren't, there's no reason to think that they're shared by the total entity. And so I gave the example of like, there are things in a galaxy which are wet, but galaxies aren't themselves wet. And he's like, no, if anything in a galaxy is wet, then galaxies are wet.
That's awesome.
And you were like, yeah, that's a perfect example of someone being like, yes, chatting to these questions in a way which is completely ridiculous.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's like, yeah, that makes you, that makes you really like intellectually tough that you're willing to say something that's obviously insane. Yep, exactly. Well, let's do that next week.
I think it'll be very fun. We might go long. We'll have to see. I'll actually be cat sitting and dog sitting, cat dog sitting.
Nice.
So there'll be cats and dogs living together on both sides of the stream.
Fair enough.
Bye.